Hi guys, so this week I chose to ask the question, upon what foundation are U.S. public schools built? And I asked 3 corresponding questions with that. So the first question I asked, what was the original setup of public school in the early U.S.? And then I asked, how is that setup still evident today? And then I asked, what are some obvious issues in the public school system that could be changed through understanding the foundation of the U.S. public school system? So just jumping right into our first question, what was the original setup of public school in the early U.S.? I found a timeline that just kind of gave a brief overview of how education began in the early U.S., and it was very focused on kind of the different classes, and it was focused on educating poor students. It was felt that public schools should only be open to them because more wealthy families could afford to hire teachers. So public schools were just for those in lower classes, I guess you could say. It was interesting. The timeline discussed one setup in which, let's see if I can find it. So this is in New York school systems, and this is in the early 1800s. So the New York Public School Society, formed by wealthy businessmen to provide education for poor children, was run on the Lancasterian model, in which there was one master who could teach hundreds of students in a single room, and then the master would give kind of like a lesson to the older students, who would then teach the younger students. And these schools like really emphasized like obedience and qualities that you would want in good workers, because it was kind of seen that even though these kids were getting an education, they weren't necessarily going to progress in society. So I think it's interesting that public school began in the United States to educate poor children, but it wasn't necessarily because we were like trying to help the poor children, or because we saw that they had potential, but because it was like a lesser valued thing, because wealthy students could hire a very well educated teacher who could pass down good skills and qualities to them. So the next question that I asked is, how is that setup still evident today? And I found an article that kind of it was really interesting, but it talked about, let's see if I can find it. So it asked the question, what would education and society in America be like if these principles weren't at the core of what is meant by public education? So what if education were turned over to publicly funded schools that did not have to adhere to these principles, and which principles would be limited and which children would be left behind? So public education, they defined it as kind of a wide range of decision making that resides at the community level, so like through the PTA or through school districts. And because of the avenues of citizen participation in the schools, public decision making occurs through the election of representatives and publicly accounted agencies who are designed to carry out the specific school functions. So it allows for a great deal of community and parental involvement and some control of what goes on in schools. So public schools are required to accept and retain all students, no matter their race, no matter religion, no matter their educational attainment, social class, family income, special needs, or personal characteristics. So that's one really powerful thing about public schools that I think we still see because of that early foundation, even though it wasn't necessarily done with the best of intentions. Public school was set up and allowed it so that each student has an opportunity to come and learn, and there is a focus on special needs, and there is a focus, it talks about in this article how there's a focus more on like the whole child in public school than in private school, potentially, because there are so many programs like free school lunch and after school programs and before school programs that support the child when they're in difficult situations that wouldn't be available if there were only private schools. Okay, and then the last question is, what are some obvious issues in the public school system that could be changed through understanding the foundation of the U.S. public school system? So I found an article that just talked about the importance of going back to basics and kind of maybe refocusing our efforts on teaching the basic things that kids need to know to allow them to appreciate education, to become problem solvers. In this article, I try not to focus on these, but it was one by the Washington Post, and I thought it correlated a lot with what we've been taught, so I decided to use it. But they interviewed Elaine Weiss, who's the national coordinator for the Broader Bolder Approach to Education, and it's a nonprofit economic policy institute that recognizes the impact of social and economic disadvantages on many schools and students. So obviously they kind of say that poverty is the biggest issue in the American school system, and reading it, they brought up some really good points about how too many students are kind of doomed from a very early age to remedial education, and are kind of taught that they have dim prospects for life. And in this article, they talk about one of the biggest problems being is we've kind of lost the focus on the basics, teaching children to think about things, to problem solve, and we're so focused on the beginning from like getting your career that we forget all of the important steps that lead up to that. Let's see. There was one more part that I thought was interesting. They also talked about how we've put too much pressure on test scores, and that we've crowded out kind of like the art and the music and drama side of schooling that cultivates a love for learning, and that draws out children's unique skills, and that we're teaching students kind of dumbed down lessons in a lot of these more impoverished areas, and that standardization has made it hard to tailor lessons to like individual needs and unique needs of the community more holistically. So I just thought that article had some interesting thoughts on my last question, and thank you for viewing my presentation.